Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, that's a nice setup for our keynote speaker, who today is Dr. Elizabeth Ferris. Dr. Ferris is the research professor and director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Ferris has a diverse experience in the field of international migration, having served as senior fellow and co-director of the project on internal displacement at the Brookings Institution. She also served as senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary General in planning the Global Summit on addressing large movements of refugees and migrants. That's a mouthful. Which led to the development of the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. Dr. Ferris, welcome.
Well, thanks, Kevin, and thanks to all of you for the opportunity to talk with you this morning. You know, when I came up with the topic for this keynote, big questions and bumpy roads, I didn't anticipate that the roads would be quite so bumpy when this time of year came around. You know, I knew we'd have problems with asylum and undocumented migration and border, regardless of which administration was elected. But now we're talking about mass deportations, further militarization of the border, cuts, probably massive cuts in refugee resettlement, perhaps the elimination of TPS and humanitarian parole, and all of the international implications of these policies taken by the U.S. government. I made the mistake, and I would recommend that you do not do this, of rereading Project 2025 this week right before I went to sleep. And just thinking about just the full range of changes that could occur, not just to immigration and refugees, an issue dear to our hearts, but also to climate and justice and race and equality and governmental institutions. I mean, clearly, I don't think that the current administration and the next administration can do all of the plans that are set out, but it's terrifying to think if only a quarter of them are implemented, what reality we will be facing. But I wanted to focus my remarks on the big questions and some of the big questions that came to me, at least, in thinking about the consequences of this election. You know, as a migration researcher, I've always believed that I hope, good research in order to inform policy, to provide evidence to policymakers to take decisions that will affect the lives of people on the move. You know, this has been kind of a bedrock of my being, my calling to do research. But all of that has been shaken in the past couple of years, where it seems like facts and evidence and research don't matter so much. What matters are perceptions. I'm sure that many of you have had conversations or maybe given talks about immigration or refugees, citing some of these studies and being confronted with these perceptions that immigrants cause crime, the border is being invaded, you know, it's bad for the economy, we can't afford this. And it seems like no matter how many studies you cite, those misconceptions remain. I recently reread Tom Nichols' book called The Death of Expertise, where he argues that the proliferation of websites and Wikipedia and lots of conspiracy theories floating around have really undermined the role of experts, that experts are no longer valued. Our opinions are no longer valued. They were the way they were a decade ago. That's not just for migration research. And he wasn't talking about us, but he was talking about doctors, you know, who are confronted with patients who say, well, I saw on the internet that this is a treatment. You know, this systematic undermining of the role of experts, I think, is a really big challenge for all of us who are committed to doing good research. If everybody's an expert, where does that leave the role of migration research? How do we confront some of these perceptions and attitudes? So I hope I'm wrong, but if this is indeed the case, here are a couple of suggestions. First, I don't think we should abandon our commitment to producing sound research, even if it seems to be unappreciated by the public and policymakers. Good analysis, rigorous research is still important for advocates and perhaps a subset of policymakers who care, what the research, what the evidence shows about migration and refugees. And I think we need to remember that history shows this, that sometimes our research and ideas that seem quite pie in the sky-ish can become reality later on when the political atmosphere changes. Lloyd Axworthy, former foreign minister of Canada, was a big proponent of this and arguing for the abolition of landmines decades before it had even a possibility of turning into a reality, or the responsibility to protect. Some of these ideas that seem quite nonsensical turn out to have a lot of relevance later on when conditions change. Secondly, I hope that at least some of us will devote more research to the attitudes of the receiving community, to these perceptions. In the international world, working particularly with refugees and internally displaced persons.
Just talking to the mic a little bit more.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now? If you missed what I said, I do have it written down. But on the international level, for a long time, we've realized the importance of looking at the host community or receiving community, the attitudes. We don't do that so much in the United States. And by the way, I don't like the term hosting community, because you host someone, you invite them. When I have a dinner party, I host people, I invite them in. But we're talking about communities that receive usually uninvited guests who stay for undetermined lengths of time. So I think receiving community is a better term. Right now, for example, rather than singling out refugees or IDPs for assistance, the main trend in humanitarian assistance are what are called area-based approaches, where you provide assistance on the basis of need, whether it's to the host community or to refugees or to IDPs or to migrants or registered refugees. Sometimes this neglects the very real and unique needs of people who are displaced, but it has the benefit of quelling some of the unrest and tension and resentment sometimes from these receiving communities. We know that research on refugee integration has long argued that integration is a two-way street, that an individual migrant or refugee needs to change to adapt to a new society, but that the new society or that society needs to change as well to adapt to the presence of a changed demographic population. But most of our research, our collective research on integration, has really focused on individual refugees or immigrants. Have they found jobs? Do they have friends? Are the kids in school? Do they speak the language? How well are they doing economically? We don't have as much research, and there's some good research on the impact of the presence of refugees or immigrants on the receiving community. And I want to really repeat what Bob Ray just emphasized. This is not just a U.S. phenomena. We see these anti-immigrants attitudes, this disregard for facts and research, and many different countries, in Malaysia and Bangladesh and South Africa and Germany and Turkey and even Canada. You see the emergence of these kinds of attitudes. So I think that understanding the way these attitudes of the receiving community intersect with the needs and rights and aspirations of the newcomers is an important issue. And here I'd like to cite some of the research done by Murat Erdogan in Turkey. He's one of the few people I know who's published for I think it's 5 or 7 years, annual surveys of attitudes of Turkish citizens toward Syrian refugees and attitudes of Syrian refugees toward living in Turkey. So he's got data on both sets, not just one. And what's most disturbing about this research in the last year or two has been to see that the gap is widening. Syrian refugees in Turkey, according to these surveys over the past 5 years, are feeling more at home. They're learning Turkish. They have more Turkish friends. Their kids are in school. They're making an income. They are integrating. The trend lines are very clear. But when you look at Turkish attitudes, it's exactly the opposite. There's more hostility, more discrimination, more agreement with phrases like, they should all go home. So you see this gap between Turkish receiving community perceptions and the attitudes of Syrian refugees who are there is widening, which is deeply troubling when you think not just about Syrian refugees, but you wonder, do we have something similar happening in our communities? Is anybody looking at this gap between perceptions of receiving communities and perceptions of those who are here? In Turkey, this reached almost a fever pitch after the February 2023 earthquake, when many, many Turks living in the areas where Syrians had settled, which was exactly the areas most affected by this devastating earthquake that killed over 50,000 people and made probably 100,000 people homeless, to see the attitudes of Turks took a dramatic turn toward the negative. There were lots of attacks on Syrians. There were calls for Syrians to get out of shelters. There were questions about why Syrians were getting tents and native Turks weren't. It sounded strangely reminiscent of what we heard after Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, these unfounded accusation that FEMA was taking money away from needy Americans to help undocumented migrants. These perceptions tend to grow and I think need further study. Yeah, so I think it's really time to do what we've been doing internationally and turn the lens on U.S. receiving communities and to understand how these perceptions are formed. Where do they come from? What's the intersection between individual attitudes and the kind of news or information they're getting? And perhaps most importantly, how do opinions change? How does the narrative change? I'm certainly not an expert on public opinion, but some of the published research on this challenges some of our assumptions, and to me raise some fundamental questions. For example, the assumption that the more diverse communities they are, the more tolerant they are of immigrants, or that the more contacts people have with immigrants, the more positive their feelings will be. The research on this is decidedly mixed. It isn't always the case. And finally, a last big question is the need to look at the relationship between anti-immigrant attitudes and democracy. For 75 years, researchers have traced the connection between authoritarian tendencies and anti-immigrant attitudes, finding that authoritarians are intolerant of groups that they perceive as deviating from the norm: ethnic background, race, religious beliefs, and immigrants. There seems to be a relationship between these authoritarian attitudes, and I'm sorry to say this, diversity. The more diversity in a community, it seems that the more authoritarian and anti-immigrant attitudes. This is really a challenge to those of us who think that diversity is wonderful and we need more of it. But what are the implications if this research is true? And further work is needed, obviously. Some of the work done in Europe, for example, after the influx of 2015, 2016, found that the impact of the mass influx didn't change, for example, German attitudes toward their society, but comparing areas in Germany that received a lot of the influx with low influx areas, found that those who received a lot of immigrants had a lot more violence, a lot more hatred, a lot more anti-immigrant attitudes. You know, what does this mean for us? And the really troubling question, does our advocacy for more refugee resettlement, more positive asylum decisions, more immigration, is that actually fueling an anti-immigrant sentiment? And is that sentiment actually undermining our democratic institutions? I hope I'm wrong, because these are kind of bedrock values that I have and I know many of you have. But I think there are some troubling questions about the relationship between what we're seeing with conspiracy theories and anti-immigrant attitudes and what's happening politically. And finally, perceptions matter. If there's one thing I've learned from the election a couple of weeks ago, is that we need to be looking not just at the experience and rights and needs of refugees and immigrants, but also about the attitudes of the receiving communities. And I think these are fundamental questions that may shape the future of immigration in this country. And I encourage you to please challenge me on any of this, because I don't want to leave you with all these provocative questions. But I think that they're fundamental questions we all need to take seriously. Thank you. Please, yes, I'm happy to take questions, and please come up with alternatives. Should I call on Kevin? Yeah, none?
Thanks, Beth. It's always great to hear you speak, and congratulations on your award tonight, by the way. I had a question about the last thing that you said, because it seems like in the United States it doesn't work like that. You know, in other words, kind of when we were looking at this in particular communities, what seemed to trigger kind of outpourings of hatred and anti-immigrant sentiment was the growth of the immigrant population. And it could be from 1 to 3% or 1 to 5%, where you didn't see it coming from New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and those places. And I wonder if that's true now or not, you know, but I thought I'd just ask you that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that many of us have had this idea that the more diverse communities, and again, New York and Los Angeles are good examples, are more tolerant, they have more contact with people who originally came from other countries, and so forth. I mean, I think the election raises some questions. You know, you look at the Hispanic vote, you look at what happened even in New York, where you saw a surge in some of this, and maybe some of us underestimated the impact of the busing of migrants to big cities like New York and Denver and Chicago on public attitudes that, you know, had been more tolerant, more supportive. But I think it needs some further work. There was another hand over here. Yes, please.
Daniel Jacoby from Erica in Baltimore. What is the research that shows that?
I'm sorry, that shows what?
That shows that the relationship between diverse communities and a tendency to authoritarianism and anti-immigrant sentiment. Where?
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of citations here. Villas and Levain, Engelhardt and Norris, Alabarosa and Elsner. I'm happy to share them with you.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
That's in. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Thanks.
I'm going to keep the theme alive and push back a little bit more. I think just maybe I think socio-legal scholars, I think, have pushed back on that idea of like reversing those variables. So like, are you sure about the democracy? Are you sure about way you're defining diversity? So I think diversity within like segregated spaces is not quite the kind of democratic diversity that are those bedrock values that we're talking about. So I think maybe just complicating it in that way.
Well, yeah, that's good to hear, and good to hear that there is a lot of research being done on diversity in different kinds of communities. So I think wait for the mic.
Maybe this is a little bit too simplistic, but It seems to me, my experience, having lived in different countries, is that politicians, in order to win, know how to take advantage of visual cues in society and make people think that there is a problem when maybe there's not a problem.
Yeah, I think that is definitely the case. And again, you see that around the world, whether it's Viktor Orban in Hungary or it's, some of the politicians in Turkey, you see the same kind of politicians using scapegoating immigrants as a way of building popular support. But maybe to give you one personal example, when my mom was about 79, she was a very pro-immigrant person living in South Texas. She came home from the store one day and she said, "There's not a single person in the Home Depot who speaks English." And of course I said, well, Spanish is a beautiful language. You're never too old to learn. But there was something in that, kind of these older Americans who feel threatened, who feel uncomfortable, and feel like they shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable in their own countries. And maybe I discounted her concerns, but maybe it's something we need to think about. Maybe it's more serious than we realize.
I wonder if you've come across or thought about the negative role that dysfunctional bureaucracies can play in fueling anti-immigrant sentiment. Looking at New York as an example.
Right.
Adams wanted to put these people who wanted to work, but it was impossible.
Right.
Because of how complicated it is to get a work permit and so on. And I just wonder, in your space, how much bureaucracy is on the radar as a sort of target to solve and, solve these sentimental problems. Because if people saw people working,
Right.
that would appear functional, that would appear positive. But really, in this city, that isn't what happened.
Yeah.
And people had a different intention.
Right.
But it didn't work out. Just curious if you
I think that's
people study bureaucracy in your space.
I haven't seen any studies on that, but I think it's a really important issue. The same thing happened in Washington, where some of the government didn't know how to respond to all these migrants and came up with patchwork solutions, and there was a lot of resentment.
Hi, my name is Margaret Cardroli. I'm with Immigrant Defenders Law Center. I just wonder how much you think actually false information, misinformation, and the political negative rhetoric has impacted, what you're seeing as to diverse communities. Because with all due respect to your mother, with regard to the example you just gave, it's likely impossible that no one at Home Depot that day spoke. Right. But so like, with all due respect to your mom, I feel like maybe it's just this negative rhetoric fuels down to the daily life of individuals. And so I was just wondering if you factored that into your assessment with regard to...
I think that's absolutely key. The misinformation, the way it's spread, the conspiracy theories, the way little things get blown out of proportion. We certainly saw that in the election and in the public discourse here. And at least, there's some good information, good research coming out on the role of all of this false information. But I also think it's related to what Tom Nichols calls the death of expertise, that, these are treated almost on the same level as sound research studies. John?
Oh, I think.
Yeah, wait for the microphone.
Yeah. Oh,
Can I go?
Oh, sorry.
Hi, my name's Ede. I'm with the Resurrection Project in Chicago. I'm not a researcher. I am in the field all the time. And I actually think it's a very big problem. So there's 100% a shift in how much, I am a Mexican immigrant, and I work a lot with Mexican immigrants, and I think there's been a massive shift as to how people feel about immigration. And I think a lot of it is, yes, there's lies, yes, there is misinformation out there, but there's also this perception of that there is no more border. And I think that that's a very difficult conversation to have with people. I crossed the border when I was 4 years old, and my entire family's undocumented, and I have DACA, and so it's like, obviously, like, I have very complicated feelings about what a border is, but I think that that was very real, and that is a very real conversation that exists in the Mexican immigrant community. And then the other thing is like the difference in treatment that folks felt, in terms of things like there's a lot of undocumented folks that don't have work permits and work. And I think hearing like you have to have a work permit to work, I think was really difficult for a lot of folks. And sort of seeing that there would be, TPS designated and then redesignated. And I think that those things really did affect the sentiment in particularly, I don't know everybody, right, obviously, but I think in the Mexican immigrant community and second generation and folks that are U.S. citizens, 21, maybe like in their 20s and 30s, who have undocumented family members and sort of see this like differentiation and treatment. So I think it's just to say that not everything is, I'm not saying that the equation, that kind of the end result is the correct result, but like that it is real. And I think it's and I don't think we should continue to ignore it.
And I think this theme of control of the border is really key. I remember back in, I think it was 2015, there was a German foreign minister who said something like, Germany can handle 1 million asylum seekers. We have the capacity to do this. What we cannot handle is a perception that we've lost control of the border. If we can manage this. And you think about managing migration, it doesn't work for Venezuelans fleeing what's happening in Venezuela or Haitians fleeing the chaos. How do you manage migration from Haiti when you look at the devastation that's occurring in Port-au-Prince? But how do you communicate that to people who are concerned about we've lost control of the border? And so I think there's a little paradox there between a need to give the impression to show that you haven't lost control of the border, and while recognizing that you can't manage all of migration, at least if you're going to uphold the obligations of the 1951 Refugee Convention and U.S. refugee law, which I guess is kind of in doubt now. But, yeah.
Hi, Bess. I'm Ferris from SOS Méditerranée. Thank you, Bess, first for bringing back the fact that we're talking about receiving communities and not host communities. My point also is on the perception of the attitudes. We have perceived, I'm coming back to Europe here, the difference of attitude between the different type of migrants. The attitude of the European states were much better for the refugees coming from the Ukraine than from North African countries or African countries, Muslim countries, Arab countries. So I want to hear you about that. The second point is on the migration crisis. At certain time in Europe, we started to talk about migration, the crisis of values, crisis of welcoming. Migration is an issue that, as Bob said, it has always been on for the story of humans, and it's more today a question of how do we welcome the people, how do we integrate them, and how do we keep with our values that have built democracy. Right. So I'm coming back to the issue of democracy here.
Yeah, I think if you look at the history of attitudes toward different kinds of migrants in every country, you find huge differences between highly skilled, between white, on issues of race, on issues of skills, on issues, all kinds of issues are different. Probably most glaring in the different treatment between Ukrainians in Europe and other nationalities seeking protection. I think we've seen that, and to some extent we've seen that in U.S. policies as well, difference in treatment of Cubans and Haitians, for example, that have gone on for decades. Okay, but maybe we should leave it. Okay, thanks.